Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Welcome to the Bill Walton Show. I'm Bill Walton. Afghanistan. Where to begin? For most of us, Afghanistan had largely slipped from our radar screen after several years of relative quiet and stability. Donald Trump had talked about leaving, but it wasn't clear whether that was actually going to happen. And then, overnight, it seems, Joe Biden orders America's immediate exit from the country, and chaos ensues. I started into creating a list of issues, which I normally do for these shows, that we want to talk about, and the list has now run to 6 pages. And so instead of me going through this, I decided to cut to the chase and talk to some real experts who've been following this for years, and I hope and will give us some insights into how we got here, where we are, and where we think this is going. Dr. Stephen Bryan has 50 years of experience in national security, and again, I came to not a 6-page list, but a 16-page list of achievements. Stephen, could you give us a quick...
I'll try. I'll do it really quickly. I started out as a professor of political science at Lehigh University, came to Washington and joined the Foreign Relations Committee staff. I was the director of the Near East Subcommittee of the Foreign Relations Committee. And later on, I went to the Defense Department, where I was the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense and founder and director of the Defense Technology Security Administration. And after I left government, that's about 20 years worth, I went into the private sector, and among other things, I was the president of a very large multinational company here in Washington, D.C.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I can't wait to dig into this with you.
I don't want to give you any more propaganda.
Kyle Shedler is the director of and senior analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. And since this issue with the Afghanistan bears not just on our national security abroad, but here at home, I thought you'd have an incredible insight into this. Kyle, what's a bit of your background?
So I've been involved in studying terrorist and insurgent ideologies really for about a little more than a decade. I got started at a nonprofit that did helping Jewish students deal with anti-Semitism on college campuses, a lot of which was coming out of Islamist organizations in the United States. So I specialized in Islamist organizations in the U.S. and then globally, how they interact with terrorist groups, what their agenda is, how they seek to foment their ideology.
Okay, thank you. Stephen, could you frame this for us? Because this, as we talked about, this seems to fan out in billions of different directions.
With Afghanistan, I think there are two major questions. The first is, why did we precipitously leave? What was behind it? And the second question, which I think is fascinating, is that when President Trump had proposed withdrawing U.S. troops, the U.S. military told him that was a bad idea, don't do it. When Mr. Biden did it, or announced it, or even before he announced it, there wasn't a peep or a boo from the Pentagon saying you shouldn't do it. In fact, they embraced it. It's strange. It seems to me this is very strange. And one wonders what's going on.
So, as I understand it, he had, Austin wasn't defense secretary, but all the chief of staffs, when Trump was president, says you can't do it.
That's right.
And then he announced, Biden says, I'm going to do it, and they just fold over.
Yeah, then Biden has the audacity to blame Trump for something he never did.
Yeah.
And was advised not to do because of the implications of what would happen,
Kyle,
which is exactly what happened.
Kyle, what's your take?
No, I think that's right. It is truly remarkable that you had a administrative state, all of the elements of the Department of Defense, the State Department, who were vociferously against exit, all of a sudden turn around and execute the most incompetent evacuation imaginable. When you had Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Milley sitting there telling congressmen that Bagram Air Base was not tactically necessary. You don't have to be a longtime military practitioner to know, well, the more airstrips you have getting people out, the faster you can get them out.
Right.
And that was all just ignored. And it is really fascinating that this was the either the Biden administration had the ability to simply steamroll the administrative state, or they did not see it as their role to get in the way of this president, whereas they did see that they had a role to prevent the Trump administration from executing policy, which I think is very curious.
So Bagram Air Base, it seems to me, now I'm new to this issue, but you look at Afghanistan on a map, and you've got Pakistan, Iran, the stands, the Russian piece. India's claiming a little bit through Pakistan. China has got a 57-mile border with Afghanistan. And so you've got 4 nuclear powers surrounding Afghanistan and one wannabe nuclear power with Iran.
Maybe they are.
Maybe they are already.
I wouldn't be. I'm not prepared to say they are not.
Well, that's on our long list of I don't know where to go with it.
Well.
So, but as you look at that, you think, well, gee, wouldn't we want to have a presence there? Let's forget about country building. I mean, remember we went into 20 years ago, and I think we were pretty smart. We aligned with was the Northern
Alliance.
Northern Alliance, and we got all the tribes working together. They hated the Taliban, and we won. And at that point, we probably just should have said, okay, well, we've won, and maybe keep an air base there, but then stop. But instead, we started country building.
That's right. That seems to be our Achilles heel. We've tried it not only in Afghanistan, we tried it in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, these places.
Iraq.
And it's failed in every case. Maybe we should learn a lesson.
And not only that, but I mean, the kind of country we were trying to build, where, it would have been maybe one thing to say to the biggest warlord that we worked with, okay, now you're in charge, don't make us come back here. It's another thing to spend $800 million on gender studies over the course of 20 years because you want to turn Afghanistan, a place which hasn't even managed monarchy, into a modern liberal democracy.
Wait, $800 million?
I think it was like 769
okay,
million.
We can round up. Okay,
about
but it really gender studies in
Everett Dirksen used to say 100 million here, 100 million there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money.
But even we were we're so out of touch with their culture. Didn't the U.S. State Department run a flag celebrating Pride Day? A couple months ago?
That's right.
Yeah.
Over the embassy in Kabul.
And Taliban's pretty much declared that they're going to run the country based on Sharia law. And what does Sharia law mean for women?
It means that they will mind their place and wear their burqas and stay out of the way if they want to stay alive or not be whipped in public or some other humiliation.
So, the implications for Americans having suffered through 20 years of Afghanistan and the people and the men and women who served in Afghanistan are terrible. I think I heard this morning that the Veterans Affairs suicide hotline has had 35,000 calls in the last 60 days.
There's deep distress in the veterans community right now. My daughter is one of them, and which we call.
Where's your daughter serve?
She served in Iraq. She
Okay.
was a lieutenant colonel, 2 tours, one of which ended her military career. But she's also a practicing psychologist, and she is deeply concerned about veterans. She gets thousands of calls now all the time. People they're terribly upset because if we had been actually defeated, we lost on the battlefield. That's one thing, but to run away is another. And these are people, their lives were lost, many wounded, many thousands of wounded, people who sacrificed themselves in these situations, and now we run away. It's very hard for them to take that on mentally. It's very disturbing for them, and I understand that. My daughter understands that. It's a terrible thing.
Kyle, do you know some?
Yeah, I mean, I know a number of veterans that fought both in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you know, we talk a lot about post-traumatic stress, but one of the most traumatic things that can happen is you can lose a war, and you can sort of lose a war post facto. So a lot of these guys have served. They went over there. They did their time. They did an honorable job. They did in a lot of cases, they did a successful job.
And they were heroes. I mean,
And they
let's
were-
be honest about it. These
and
are
then-
very courageous people.
And then to have that, the reason for having done all those things taken away from you after the fact is very traumatic.
Yeah. Well,
You know.
Obama did it in Iraq, didn't he? Mm-hmm. He pulled us out. It wasn't as messy as this Afghanistan thing for us. It was messy for the Iraqis.
So it's one thing for Biden to do it, but to have Lloyd Austin, who had been a general, to have Milley do it, and all the other chiefs of staff who presumably have an emotional connection and leadership responsibility for those who serve under them. How can you do this to your own people?
They're gutless wonders, aren't they? I mean, to put it bluntly. I mean, it's awful to think that, look, if they had objected and the president said to them, I don't care, you're going to do this, civilians rule. Okay, I would understand that. But there's no evidence that ever happened. In fact, the reverse. The head of CENTCOM is saying, oh, well, the Taliban were our counterparts. We worked very well with them.
Well, there
What's
was that Washington Post article where apparently General McKenzie talked with the Taliban and agreed that the Taliban would be allowed to provide security in Kabul, and we would provide security for the airport. If that Washington Post article is correct, the Taliban offered to allow us to control security in Kabul, and we said no, which means all of the Taliban checkpoints, all of the problems that we had getting Americans and special immigrant visa holders through those checkpoints to get to the airport, all of those were a self-own. They were an own goal, because we could have provided that security and made sure that they got through.
Well, this all
We
gets
chose
back
not
to the real fundamental point. The real fundamental point is that the U.S. cut a deal with the Taliban secretly, that they would turn over control of everything to them, even before the battles were lost. In early July, we started pulling out of bases. By July 3rd, I think that's the right date, we were out of 7 bases, including Bagram. And by the end, we were out of 15 bases. We just left. And this was part of the deal. It had to be. As we ferreted out people and removed ourselves, leaving behind billions of dollars of equipment and everything else. So I think that the real story, and by the way, today there was a transcript that was released between a conversation between President Biden and Ashraf Ghani, who was the president of Afghanistan.
Ashraf Ghani. Continue.
And it's very interesting because Biden knew fully well that we were leaving. Ghani must have known by then. And there's a line in this which I think is really amazing where Biden says, we will continue to provide close air support if we know what your plan is. Well, there's 2 things about that. His plan was to try and survive, of course. But we couldn't provide close air support because we no longer had any bases to provide it from. And Biden knew that. So, what's going on here? It's a con job. It's a tap dance to try and, make pretend that we were still talking to Ghani when in fact we were talking to the Taliban only.
Which we had been doing. I mean, which we had been doing for years through the Taliban embassy in Qatar.
That's right.
We pushed the Afghan government, which we were supposedly backing, out of the negotiations and negotiated solely with the Taliban for years.
Yeah, ostensibly because we couldn't get the Afghan government to agree to commit suicide. So we just
Okay.
did it by ourselves.
Let me do a quick check here. You're watching the Bill Walton Show. I'm here with Stephen Bryan and Kyle Scheidler. And we're talking about sort of the stunning deception that went on and the lack of character that our senior leaders in the military seem to have exhibited, did. But I want to turn now to this president of Afghanistan, who was last seen bundling $169 million and getting on a plane. Did he actually have cash in a suitcase? Was that
Yeah, it was
that,
money.
was that
I mean,
just
it was
cinematic?
cash money.
understanding,
The only question I have is,
Now he was
what kind of
handpicked.
money?
We put him in there,
Yeah.
and this was a Davos president, if there ever was one. I mean, he gave TED talks.
Right.
He'd written about how to save failed states, and this guy was big on the lecture tour. And we put him in. He was utterly unconnected with the tribal cultures of Afghanistan. Right. In fact, in his TED talk, he said, "Well, Afghanis don't really understand capital in terms of capital formation. They do understand cash." And he was referring about well, he was one of them.
Apparently so, yeah. When he finally flew out on that helicopter.
I'm laughing, but it's just the American people did not know a lot of all this. Now, was the Trump deal that he was talking about, people say it was a mistake for him to be talking with the Taliban. Was that a blunder?
A mistake for whom?
Trump. Donald Trump was negotiating with the Taliban.
My own personal view is he should not have. I think that was an error on his part. But it's a big difference between talking to someone and giving away the shop. And he didn't give away anything. And I think it's really strange. Even Mr. Biden's latest talk to the American people, where he says that it's Trump's fault somehow. It wasn't Trump's fault. It was Biden's fault. It was Biden's decision from the start to the finish.
And I think, Trump, we have to remember Trump inherited those negotiations. And one of the sticky things about Washington, D.C. is that a lot of people in Washington, D.C. think that peace processes and negotiations can go on forever. And I think Donald Trump came into office with the idea that negotiations are to be won. And you get what you wanted out of the negotiation, and then you execute the deal, which is not the Washington, D.C. culture. And so he saw a negotiation taking place and said, okay, let's try to win it. And from what we understand, the Taliban didn't execute on certain requirements that the Trump deal had in place. And so they essentially walked away.
So there was no deal. So this notion that somehow Biden inherited a deal with Trump had struck was wrong.
That's right. I mean, he didn't inherit anything other than a meeting place in Qatar.
Which is another part of the Washington, D.C. peace process culture, which is you have to adhere to deals that aren't struck, that aren't agreed to. He's laughing because he knows I'm right. That you have a deal on the table and you make an offer, and the other side says no, and then you go ahead and do what you said do what you offered to do anyway, which happens in D.C. all the time.
I think we should add that there was a lot of criticism in Washington, and still is, that the Afghan regime was pretty corrupt.
And it was.
And it was. I mean, there was no doubt about that. So was the Iraqi regime corrupt. I mean, this is just a fact of life, I think. But you don't make national security decisions based on corruption. At least I don't think you should. I think you make it on your national interest. What's your national interest here? And what's the best, from the point of view of cutting and running from Afghanistan, you have really harmed the U.S. posture around the world. Nobody will trust us right now. Nobody should trust us right now. And that's evidence of it, And the more information that comes out that shows that this was, that our military didn't fight for it, they didn't want it, they were willing to go along with it, they were weak reeds, contemptuous in some ways, that really hurts us. That really hurts us everywhere, in the Middle East, especially, in Asia, certainly. That I think is a big price to pay for what I think was a very foolish and dangerous thing.
Kyle, who's been getting on the planes?
I wish I knew. The Biden administration has been extremely cagey about the question of who are we actually evacuating from Afghanistan. they like to cite these top numbers. The last one I saw was 125,000 about. And then, they said, well, 7,000 of those.
125,000, is that a number you believe, or do you?
That's a number I heard.
Okay, all right.
Whether I believe it's a top number or not, it's been quoted.
Okay.
And of that, 7,000 were special immigrant visa holders, and 5,000 about approximately
What's that
were
mean,
Americans.
special immigrant visa holder?
So a special immigrant visa is for Iraq and Afghanistan for individuals that were engaged in helping the U.S. effort. So this is the kind of person that most Americans think we should be
but
helping.
I've heard that's morphed into
translators, government employees, those sorts of things.
But I've heard that's
intelligence
morphed
assets.
into people like Uber drivers and caterers and all sorts of
It
people.
absolutely
that-
has. And then there's an expanded, I think it's called a P2 program, which is an even larger subset of people.
So the Afghans, 66,000 Afghan soldiers died fighting along us.
That's right.
I mean, what does this say about their sacrifice?
Well, they've been sold out. That's what it says. I mean, totally sold out. Everyone said, well, they didn't fight. But, here you have an army that lost its air cover, which the U.S. provided all along. The Afghan Air Force was pitifully poor. So we provided the air cover, the close air support, the counterinsurgency capabilities. Secondly, their supplies were cut off because we provided the supplies that disappeared. So they realized they were just cut adrift and they had no help anymore. Their counterparts who were working with Americans and some from NATO just left in the night. And they didn't just leave, and say goodbye and we have to go home now. They left in the middle of the night.
Bagram was overnight.
Oh yeah, 3 o'clock
Overnight.
in the morning.
Yeah, they all just departed.
They didn't tell the other guys, the Afghan guards. They had no idea. They turned off the electricity. They yanked out the comms and the radars, and they went.
Seems to me like this whole chain of command ought to be court-martialed.
Well, that's on CENTCOM. CENTCOM planned this operation.
CENTCOM
Central
is-
Command,
Okay.
which has responsibility for the Middle East. By the way, they just jammed Israel into CENTCOM. They used to be in European Command, EUCOM. And I think the Israelis have to rethink that pretty quickly because it's not a place they want to be these days. CENTCOM made a mess. Now, you can say, okay, the Pentagon was weak and they didn't plan and they were, the whole thing was screwed up. But the fact is that was on CENTCOM. They had the responsibility. And what does the head of CENTCOM said? Taliban really helped us. That's what he said. They were great. They helped us assure security to get people to the airport. Well, I remember people getting shot and killed and hanged and mutilated and every other damn thing trying to get to the airport. So what's he talking about?
Kyle, you do domestic terrorism. Now, I know Mark Milley, is it General Mark Milley? He's worried about white rage.
Yes, he is.
He may find he gets it now.
Well, yeah, there's some white rage right here, directed at him. But what about real terrorists? What about people? How many of these 125,000 do we think will be security problems inside the United States?
Well, we know something like somewhere between 100 and 350 have already pinged on the biometric screenings that we do for actual terror ties.
Okay.
I think that number's probably going to be low. We know that the French are already surveilling Afghan evacuees because they were identified as having Taliban ties. The United Kingdom had an individual arrive in Birmingham, England, who was on the no-fly list. So apparently you can be on the no-fly list and still get on a military air flight out of Kabul, was the lesson there. So the answer is we have no idea. And they're going to tell you that they're vetting these people. They're going to tell you that they have information about who these people are, and they don't. Not
And
really.
we have an open border. And, people are crossing our border every day. Some of them are Afghans.
Yeah, they just moved the southern border to Kabul airport, essentially, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and it's open. I mean, it's very reckless. And I think, our goal in Afghanistan from the beginning was supposed to be to deal with terrorism. Al-Qaeda, was the target, the original target. And now, by the way, the Al-Qaeda guys are returning. The ones that left Afghanistan are now coming back.
So break it down. Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, for those of us that don't follow this, I mean, they're really making common cause, aren't they?
They have a common cause. They are all jihadists. They are all waging jihad to impose Islamic
these
law.
distinctions that some people try to make, oh, well, there's the Taliban, that's just
And
blurring over.
The notion that the Taliban has more in common with us than it has with ISIS is a type of insanity you can only find inside the Beltway. It's nuts.
So another insanity inside the Beltway. How many troops do we have there? 3,500?
At the end,
Yeah.
before we pulled, 2,500, I think was the number.
Yeah, until they plussed it up. For the
So what are
evacuation.
we doing with 25,000 Humvees there? I mean, we left $90 billion worth of military equipment, and you look at the numbers of pieces of equipment we had for 2,500 soldiers. I mean, were they going to set up an Army surplus shop in Bagram,
There was an article,
Air Base?
There was an article this morning that said that the Taliban now have enough arms, I mean, it's the size of its military, including all the equipment that we left, that it's larger now than 7 or 8 European states and Ukraine.
But okay, well, but if it were servicing a number of soldiers who would actually use the equipment, we'd spend
We didn't
billions
take
and
it
billions
out.
of
We
dollars.
were cutting up equipment.
We
for a while.
never do. I mean, most people don't realize that, but we almost never take equipment out of places. We'll blow it up in place. We'll disable it. We'll sell it to the local government, but we don't take things home because it's too expensive.
And a lot of this stuff's pristine. I've seen the photos. I mean, it's just lined up. You see all these Humvees with guns on top and all that, just lined up brand new.
And then the other thing is people don't remember we needed a deal with the Russians to get equipment into Afghanistan when the war started, to move it through the Central Asian countries. Well, that all got cut off. So we could not use the railways and ships and stuff that we used to bring equipment in. The only option we had was air.
Who cut it off?
That was part of the falling apart of relations between the U.S. and Russia in the past 20 years.
Okay, so in terms of managing min and material, the Defense Department has done a lousy job on both.
Fair
Well,
statement.
They clearly didn't care about it.
Didn't care.
Yeah, I mean, it's just money, right?
And you're watching the Bill Walton Show. I'm here with Kyle Scheidler and Stephen Byron, and we're talking about the massive incompetence and corruption that it seems to exist inside the Pentagon and the defense establishment, and why yours truly is getting a very sinking feeling about where this is going for the United States. Bagram Air Base. Who now is going to end up with control of Bagram Air Base?
Oh, the Taliban has it.
Initially. Don't you think that's
Oh, you're
going to,
thinking,
don't you think the Chinese have got their eyes set on that? Don't you think if you look at all those state actors around there, don't you believe
It's
that?
possible. I wouldn't rule it out, but I think that the Taliban they're very ambitious now, as they should be. I mean, they have an air force. I mean, we left them one.
Can they fly it?
Well, they flew some helicopters yesterday, including a guy hanging from one.
Yeah, whether they are flying the helicopter or they're just pointing a pistol at the head of the guy who's flying the
I
helicopter,
read
it
this
doesn't really
morning-
matter.
It sounds like that's
Yeah, I
the
read
case.
this morning that they're now recruiting some Afghan pilots that were trained by us to fly these aircraft. Basically, they have the coin aircraft, which are Brazilian aircraft that were expensively made in the United States, but they're Brazilian origin, which is a propeller-driven aircraft, and they have lots of helicopters. So that's the Air Force. And one C-130 I saw. I don't know why that was left.
So how does this play out with China and with the other state actors around? They're not going to just let that sit there and.
Well, the Chinese, of course, are interested in two things. One is a deal that will keep the Taliban from supporting the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, because the Uyghurs are Muslims that the Chinese don't like, and the Uyghurs don't like them. And that's part of it. And then there's a lot of minerals and wealth in Afghanistan that could be exploited if there's peace.
$1 trillion worth of rare
At least,
minerals.
yeah. So especially rare earth materials.
Yeah.
So, the Chinese are not foolish. I mean, they know how to run a business.
Well, my guess is they're going to use the their financing is the vehicle to get in. I mean, they're financing most of Pakistan now, and they're very influential there. You go in, if you're Chinese, you come in and say, well, look, you get Bagram airbase, you can't really run it. We can help you do that. And we'll refurbish this and do this, and we'll build some new highways and things like that. And pretty soon they've got the whip hand.
Yeah, I'm more interested in what the Russians might do, because they have, big black eye in Afghanistan of their own, and whether they will approach Taliban. They haven't recognized the Taliban yet, but I think they're moving in that direction.
But they're all leaving their embassies in Kabul.
Their embassies operating, yes.
Yeah, and China,
Yeah, absolutely.
everybody.
By the way, the administration said, well, maybe we'll recognize the Taliban, and this close. So
I mean, they've
think
already floated development aid to the Taliban.
that's right.
Yeah.
So they're getting in a position. I would think, and if they won't do it right away because they're afraid of the political reaction at home, but 2 months from now, I'll bet we reopen the U.S. Embassy in Kabul.
I'm concerned about the Qataris and the Turks, because I know the Turks want Kabul airport really bad. They probably want Bagram too. The Qataris were the first people to land a commercial jet following the U.S. handover of the airport to the Taliban. Qatari relationship with the Taliban is excellent. They were the moderators for all of our discussions with the Taliban over the past 10 plus years. The Turks' relationship with the Taliban is okay. There's some tension there. The Turks, I think, if they get the airport, that's where you're going to see some interesting interactions between them and China. They are definitely pushing the Central Asian country. Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has a large sort of Turkic supremacy.
That's right.
Notion. So he wants to exert influence over Central Asia. He wants to exert influence over the Uyghurs in China. So that could get very interesting very quickly.
Yeah, I'm not sure about it. I mean, there's no doubt that Turkey's very ambitious, especially in the stands. Southern Russia, too. It's the Ottoman stamping ground, and even before that, a Byzantine stamping ground. It goes back 2,000 years almost. So, yeah, and Erdogan is very clearly pushing that kind of approach. I don't know if it's going to play in Afghanistan. The Taliban are very difficult, as the Turks will find out.
You've written also about sort of, you talked about a strategic retreat that we seem to be making worldwide. The United States seems to be making worldwide. You guys have both covered this. What's happening?
Well, we are in the middle of a major strategic retreat, not only in Afghanistan.
Yeah, obviously there.
Iraq, Middle East. I mean, let me just put a few little items on the table. We pulled out all our air defenses from the UAE, from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, and from Jordan. Especially Jordan is really a surprise to me. Why did we do that? We claimed we needed them for something else, but we don't. We didn't put them anywhere else. We just pulled them out. And we didn't ask, we just took. So we essentially left them on their own. We have taken our bombers, which we kept in Guam, the B-52s and the B-1s, out of Guam and pulled them back to the United States. Why? Why did we, it's not clear exactly why we did that. Of course, our aircraft carrier that was stationed at Yokohama has been used in the Afghanistan, supposedly used. I don't know what purpose it has, but it's not in Asia right now. So whether it goes back or not, I don't know. We just did an exercise. It was a good exercise in the Western Pacific with our allies, the British, the Australians, the Japanese, and the Indians, which is a very good thing, I think. And that was the one hopeful sign, I'll say, that I can see. But otherwise, the handwriting's not so good, and a lot of people in Asia are very nervous, especially about Taiwan. But also, of course, that means they're very nervous about China. The Japanese especially have said that any attack on Taiwan would be existential for Japan. So
Taiwan's, what, 70 miles from
yeah,
Japan?
A little bit more, but not much more. Yeah. Yeah, it's from Japan. No, it's further, but depends
Well,
what.
I think from the southern island.
If you take the southern island,
Yeah.
yeah, but it's close to Okinawa.
Right.
And of course, it's very close to China.
Well, the Middle East pulling these weapons out, isn't that a way to make nice with Iran? I mean, Biden seemed,
Yeah, I mean,
all these
that's-
folks seem to think that Iran is like, we've got to reestablish our Iran deal and bring them into the nuclear club. I mean, what's going on
Well,
there?
I think that's a cover story for a different argument. I mean, in other words, the nuclear talks, whatever they are, which have been going on for a while now, since Biden came into office, is, I think, a cover for what we really have in mind, which is the political alignment with Iran. And that means, to diminish the role of Saudi Arabia and to admit that Iran now has, Iran is going to be in Iraq, essentially running Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, where it has Hezbollah forces, which are proxies for Iran, and Iranian advisors.
What's the global elite's fascination with Iran?
Well, I think it's a big country. It's a rich country. It's a powerful, increasingly powerful country, at least on paper. Has a huge amount of missiles. Probably already, in my opinion, may already have nuclear weapons.
Well, that makes it sound legitimate. Would that mean we abandon everybody else? In order
Well,
to-
that's the problem.
Well, and I think they also, I mean, one of the things they hold against the other regional allies, and this was, a big part of the Trump administration Middle East plan was, and because both Trump and Biden wanted to get out of the Middle East to a certain extent, and to get out, you have to sort of take a hand in who's going to replace you. And under Trump, we clearly chose the Israelis, the Saudis, the Emiratis, who are sort of traditional regional allies, and we were trying to push them up and get them to cooperate as closely as possible. And the Biden administration and the Obama administration before it, their preference for who replaces the United States in the Middle East has been around since 2009, if not earlier. And probably this goes back,
It's an old story. It's an old story, but Trump, I think, held the line properly and was very effective in that regard. And of course, the Abraham Accords were really a huge breakthrough in terms of the geostrategic
Abraham Accords were
the deal between Israel and the UAE and others to create peace between these, which also means that Israel and those countries can cooperate militarily, which is the really important factor.
and economically, too.
And economically and technologically as well. But, so you have that, I think that was a piece of genius by Trump. And he deserves a Nobel Prize for it, in my opinion.
If that was worth anything anymore.
well. That's a good
Well,
point.
it'd be nice to give it to somebody who deserved it as opposed
in
to
a
the
while.
alternative.
You're watching the Bill Walton Show. I'm here with two experts from the Center for Security Policy, Kyle Scheidler and Stephen Bryan. And we're talking about what the fascination is with Iran and where we think this might go from here. Is this really signaling, though, that Biden does not have a foreign policy? Biden only has a domestic policy, and what he really wants to do is suck everything
No,
out
I
of
don't
our
agree with
involvement
that.
around the world?
No, he has a foreign policy. So retreat from obligations to our former ally, or allies and former allies as much as possible, line up with Iran, and then find a way to make it. I think he's looking for a way to make a deal with the Chinese. I think that's coming. I think we'd be fools not to realize that he's going to sell us out in China. I think he is.
I think that's right, but I do think there's something to the notion that the Biden administration is inwardly focused, that they see enemies domestically, not overseas. You had, for the first time ever, the Biden administration directed our Office of the Director of National Intelligence to do reports on domestic threats, not international threats, which is their role and their purpose. So I think there is definitely something about the Biden administration that they see actual enemies abroad as friends, and they see fellow countrymen who disagree with them as enemies.
You got a point. But why would we cut the defense budget when China is growing more powerful and challenging us in Asia and elsewhere around the world?
Well, let's dig into the China piece, because China, all the major corporations now are just think we are being ridiculous to think China is anything other than honest intentions, and we got to keep doing business with them. You talk to the NBA, Nike, Walt Disney. I mean, everybody wants to be in China to get hands on that 400 billion person middle class. And our social media companies are making common cause with China. I mean, Google will work with China, but they won't work with their own Defense Department. Although they might work with this Defense Department, that may be changing.
Things have changed, yes.
So it seems like there's this realignment where a lot of the elites and all the major corporations and the other power players are also lining up on China's side on a lot of these issues. And you're saying now you think that's going to go, the administration's going to
Yeah, I think
sell us out.
Well, let's see what the Chinese strategy is first. I mean, the Chinese strategy is to dominate what they call the first island chain, which means right in the middle of that chain is Taiwan. So the question becomes how to get Taiwan, and will the U.S. stay out of it if they get it, and that's the game. And of course, they've been threatening Taiwan now with military overflights, bombers, fighter planes, naval exercises, missile exercises. I was in Taiwan in '96 when they had a big missile threat to Taiwan. It was very scary, by the way. So that's what's going on. And I think the Chinese strategy is to create a kind of situation where the Taiwanese basically surrender. That's what they're after. They don't want a war if they can avoid it, but they want to put a lot of pressure on Taiwan and on the United States. And they're doing it quite effectively, I think. From a capitalistic point of view, to use your terminology, our major companies, for the most part, are doing a lot of business in China, and they want to continue doing a lot of business in China, so they clearly are biased. So industrially, because, we've given most of our industry over to China anyway, haven't we? I mean, if you look at the picture, semiconductors, computers, electronics, automobiles, automobile components, everything has been moved. You can't buy anything today that doesn't say made in China on it. So we've allowed that to happen without any real attempt. The only real one was a sort of attempt by President Trump to put some of these industries into the United States if he could. He tried to do it with the Taiwanese. Even Taiwan, by the way, has invested a couple of $100 billion in China. Your Apple computers, Apple iPhones are made in China by a company called Foxconn. And Foxconn's owned by, they have 1 million employees in China. And Foxconn is owned by Hanhai Precision, which is a Taiwanese company. People don't realize that. So, all of this means that our economy is increasingly and utterly dependent on China today. Very risky.
So you see the end game as Taiwan being sort of enveloped and sucked into mainland China over time rather than something that
Yeah, well,
involves-
the old Kuomintang in Taiwan, which was the Chiang Kai-shek's party.
Sure, yeah.
And there's the opposition party right now, the DPP, the Democratic Party in Taiwan is in power, is very pro-China. And, and they're putting pressure on the public and on the government in Taiwan. And, if they win an election, the game is over. The Chinese know that. The Chinese know it very well. So it's a close, there's a level of tension and pressure that some people are going to say it's not worth it.
What is it? China's 3 warfares or 4 warfares or how many they've got?
I don't know.
Unrestricted warfare.
It's cultural, it's political, it's economic. I mean, they don't see it as just.
That's right. It's the whole spectrum.
And you're saying that this is a much more nuanced way to get at Taiwan.
Well, it's not very nuanced, but it's certainly staged.
Well, compared to showing up with a cruiser and banging away with cannons.
Right. Look, we've done a lot of studies of what would happen in a military attack on Taiwan, and every one of them concludes that the Taiwanese would lose unless we come in. And even if we come in, it's not a sure thing.
The last one I heard about was even if we came in, we don't win.
I said it's not a sure thing. And so, this is discouraging Washington. I think, if you ask the current Joint Chiefs and the current leadership in the Pentagon, I think they say we don't want to get involved in a war there because we're going to lose, so we're not going to do it.
Well, does the current Joint Chiefs want to get involved in any war anywhere?
Not likely at the moment.
Okay, so we've really shut it
Of course,
down.
nobody wants to get involved in a war. I mean, I don't want to say something that's not true. I mean, the Pentagon is going to be war averse just as they're risk averse.
Well, you need to be. You've got to be calculated about
That's
how you
right.
get into something where you
And we're
people
dealing with
killed. But on
nuclear
the other hand,
powers.
there are legitimate interests you need to defend.
it is their job to say if we get into a war, we will find a way to win it. To say we just don't want to do that is not really an option. Like the choice may not be handed to you, and if you don't have a choice except to go to war, how do you win? That's their job.
Yeah.
That's where their job starts.
Yeah, but there's another factor here. If we got involved in a conflict in Asia, we don't have any command and control systems with our allies in Asia, other than Korea. That's to say, we have no command and control system with Japan. We have absolutely nothing with Taiwan. We have nothing with Australia, surprisingly, and of course, nothing with India. I mean, if we were serious, we would put together a proper command and control system and at least have some capability to resist a Chinese attack. Right now, we can't do it by ourselves anymore. It's not possible. And Japan has a fairly interesting Air Force, has a good Navy. Taiwan has a big Air Force, not as good as Japan's, but pretty good. But we can't even deconflict them in a conflict. So how can we operate there? I mean, these are simple things, not simple operationally, but simple conceptually, that we could do to give us a chance to prevail. And right now, we're not taking that chance. We're just leaving it drift. And drift is very dangerous, extremely dangerous.
Well, as predicted, we've run out of time, and we've gone past your wife's magic 40 minutes.
I'll hear about it later.
Stephen's wife produces webinars, and we always seem to get, but we're all just getting very interesting here because I'm trying to figure out if anybody's got any America First in them in the current administration, and I'm hearing
Not
no,
really.
no. So the only solution to this is political. I mean, only, but I mean, in this administration, we're not likely to see course change.
We need some political change.
Yeah. Kyle, last words?
No, I think that's right. I mean, the only America First in them is in their targeting and their counterterrorism interests. They're more focused on Americans than they are on the rest of the dangerous world.
Guys, you're at the Center for Security Policy. You've got a terrific website. Your writings are all on there. You've got a blog. What's your blog? Is the Stephen Breyer?
Brian's blog.
Brian's blog?
Yeah.
And it's the go-to blog for almost everybody in the defense establishment. Lots of very interesting strategic thinking and writing. And Kyle, you've done some amazing stuff. So I highly recommend, if you are intrigued by what we've been talking about, next step would be the Center for Strategic Policy website. Been talking with Stephen Breyer. Brian. We got to spell that name differently. And then Kyle Scheidler.
The other one's ice cream.
About of Afghanistan and its implications, and this is not over, and we'll have them back to talk some more, and hope you enjoyed this. And as always, you can find us, subscribe on YouTube or any of the other major podcast platforms, or on our website, thebillwaltonshow.com. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Want more? Click the subscribe button or head over to thebillwaltonshow.com to choose from over 100 episodes. You can also learn more about our guest on our Interesting People page. And send us your comments. We read every one, and your thoughts help us guide the show. If it's easier for you to listen, check out our podcast page and subscribe there. In return, we'll keep you informed about what's true, what's right, and what's next. Thanks for joining.